Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic, Lecture 23, Slavery Under Attack. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the top. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, as well as be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical context. Now, with that, let's begin. Now, we left off last time, we were discussing the Old South. And one of the things I mentioned, of course, was that there was a rapid increase between 1820 and 1860 in the number of slaves in the United States, specifically in the U.S. South, the Old South. And I noted that it increased from about 1.5 million in 1820 all the way up to 4 million slaves by 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. And of course, this parallels the southern states' rapid economic growth with King Cotton. And of course, hence the dependence on slavery. Now, don't forget though, not everyone in the South actually owned slaves. In fact, proportionally, between that same time period, 1820 and 1860, the number of whites who actually owned a slave decreases from about 34% in 1820 all the way down to some estimates about 25% by 1860. In other words, only 1 out of every 4 Southern whites actually owned a slave. The reason for this decrease is as more and more slave owners began to sell their slaves to larger plantations, especially from the Upper South to Lower House, the domestic slave trade we talked about last time. However, even though upwards of 75% of Southerners do not own slaves, the ideal of slave ownership permeated all classes, and it determined the Southern society's hierarchical character. Southerners vehemently defended the institution of slavery because it gave all whites a feeling of superiority over blacks and a kinship, if not quite equality, with elite other whites. Consequently, white Southerners supported the institution of slavery, whether they actually owned a slave or not. Now, as slavery became more important to the South's economy and the Southern way of life, the institution increasingly came under attack both from within African American slaves and from without some Northern white abolitionists. And also freed slaves or other African Americans. Now we're going to break this lecture down in a couple of two different parts here. We're going to talk first about the slave revolts from within, then we'll switch to the without category, how slavery is under attack. Because the reality is, slaves didn't like being enslaved. Big surprise, right? And our history of our country, and throughout the world, but we're talking about U.S. history here, history is dotted with slave conspiracies, slave uprisings, both large and small. And I gave you some examples many weeks ago about how small ways that African Americans tried to maintain some level of humanity, tried to push against the institution of slavery. We talked about things like working more slowly, playing on those stereotypes. Or the one fun example where 2 men were asked to dig a grave for a white slave master who had died. And they kept digging and digging and digging until finally some white foreman comes along and says, "Hey, why you guys keep digging this thing so deep? It only needs to be 6 feet." And the reply from the slaves was, "We just want to get him as close as possible to where he's going, i.e. hell." But while those were more humorous instances and small ways to maintain some level of humanity and, again, oppose the institution of slavery largely, Southern history is also dotted with these stories of slave conspiracies and plots. And it's one of those things that is passed along from generation to generation. Every white owner, every white Southerner knew of the horror stories of the last-minute failed efforts of slave conspiracies. Now, one of the more famous ones in the 1800s is the case of Gabriel Prosser. Gabriel Prosser was a preacher and a blacksmith. And he had organized slaves for an attack in Richmond, Virginia in 1800. Now, the general idea was, hey, we're going to start this quick rebellion, kill a few whites, and hope to cause a popular uprising among not only slaves, but also the poor whites in the area who were in many ways living in a similar manner to slaves. Now, their freedom was not taken away from them, but they were living, in many cases, not much better economically speaking. But they had that kinship. And of course, the goal of Gabriel Prosser, though, was to create a free black state where slaves could go and live freely. Unfortunately for Gabriel Prosser, on the day that the rebellion was planned, there was a huge rainfall, and it had to be postponed to a later date. And this postponement allowed the suspicion and the whispers to filter into the ears of area whites in Richmond, Virginia. And the then governor of Virginia, James Monroe, future president, called in the state militia, and Prosser, along with 23 other co-conspirators, were executed. Now, again, this was a last-minute, almost saved by the rain, if you will, of a slavery revolt that was planned and almost carried out. Perhaps a more well-known one is the story of Denmark Vesey. Denmark Vesey, we don't know everything about his history. We believe he was born into slavery in the island of St. Thomas in the Caribbean, but he had been a free black for more than 20 years before being accused of planning an uprising in 1822. Now, it's a very strange case because he moves there to Charleston, South Carolina, as a free black man, and he moves around in the city as a free black in a place where you might wonder, why is he even there? This is not the place you want to be as an African American. Well, even after he gained his freedom, though, Vesey was committed to not only help slaves, he continued to socialize, he continued to identify with slaves. He became increasingly hell-bent on helping his new friends break the bonds of slavery. Now, in 1819, he became a little more radicalized. And of course, you remember from the last lecture, 1819 is the year that we start having the debates over should slavery be extended into Missouri or should they apply the Northwest Ordinance. And of course, thanks to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, slavery was now extended and expanded. And the whole debate over this really began to radicalize Denmark Vesey. He realized that it's not going to get better. Slavery's not dying out. This is when he begins to start to plan a revolt. Now, he's in a unique position, right? He's free. He's also a preacher. And he begins using his Bible study meetings as a way to recruit co-conspirators to plot this uprising. And once he had enough men, then he began to use the meetings to actually coordinate and plan the actual attack. And of course, he inspires slaves because he compares the African Americans overthrowing their masters to that of in the Bible when God and Moses lead the Israelites out of Egypt, of course, who were slaves in Egypt. Now, he had actually quite a strong plan. Most slave uprisings were usually quite simple. It was kill whites in the plantation, move to the next plantation, kill more whites, and walk to freedom. That was the general policy. But Denmark Vesey was a little more thought out. His plan was to launch a coordinated attack from multiple sides on the local arsenal in Charleston, South Carolina. And it was called the Charleston Meeting Hall Arsenal building. And once they secured these weapons, then they were going to take them down to the docks, down to the bay, commandeer a ship, and sail to Haiti. Again, he's not only inspired by, of course, the debates over the Missouri Compromise, but also, of course, he's inspired by the Haitian Revolution. And remember, the Haitian Revolution is one of the only truly successful slave revolts in history where these slaves actually got what they wanted. They ended the institution of slavery on their own by overthrowing and killing whites. And of course, Haiti's still a poor country as a result of that, due to other issues that we can't talk about during this time frame. But, so their goal was to plan this coordinated attack on the arsenal, get weapons, go down to the water, commandeer a ship, and sail to Haiti, and hey, kill some whites along the way. Now, beginning in May, though, there started being whispers of a conspiracy that may or may not happen. And unfortunately for Denmark Vesey, two slaves by the names of Joe LaRoche and George Wilson began to offer very specific testimony to the local mayor in saying that there's a rising coming. It was planned for July 14th. Now, why would a slave do this? Well, George Wilson was a mixed race slave who was fiercely loyal to his master. And again, there were some that for whatever reason, whether it was they were favored. Again, this was a mixed race slave, so he had maybe a little favor with his master. He was treated better, and maybe he took that as feelings of superiority. In either case, these two slaves rat out the conspiracy. And the local mayor, James Hamilton, was told about it. He organized a citizens' militia who began to hunt down and patrol the streets for weeks until they began to round up as many co-conspirators as possible, including the 55-year-old Denmark Vesey. They would be thrown into the Charleston Working House, which is the newly appointed court of magistrates, and they were held there. They were tortured. They were beaten. They were threatened, basically up to the point where they were give their own testimony to this conspiracy, trying to basically beat confessions out of them. And ultimately, they will all be put to death for it. Again, the penalty for it is always death. Now, while these two events, both the Gabriel Prosser and the Denmark Vesey, were just planned, they weren't executed. There was one, however, that was carried out. And of course, that was the case of Nat Turner. In 1831, Nat Turner actually started a rebellion in Virginia. Now, notice some of the trends here. He's a slave. He's a literate slave whose owner had helped him learn how to read. He was also a lay preacher. Notice, Prosser was a preacher. Denmark Vesey was a preacher. Nat Turner was a preacher. And it was this intelligent and strong religious commitment for Nat Turner that drew people to him. He became a leader in the slave community. And interestingly, it was these qualities that also made Nat Turner's master show him kindness and give him preferable treatment. Even though Turner at one point had actually run away for a month. Normally this would be a big, big deal, and it was. But despite running away for a month at one point due to the foreman beating him, Nat Turner's master actually showed him kindness, gave him extra freedoms compared to most slaves. But Turner began plotting his revolt after a vision he had while he was praying, in which he saw, quote, white spirits and black spirits engaged in a great battle. The sun was darkened, the thunder rolled in the heavens, and blood flowed in the streams, unquote. Turner, along with 5 other slaves, on the morning of August 20th, 1831, snuck into Nat Turner's owner's house. And the first person they killed was Nat Turner's owner, the one who showed kindness to him. The one who, at one point, Turner will actually say about his owner, quote, was to me a kind master, and placed the greatest confidence in me. In fact, I had no cause to complain of his treatment of me, unquote. Think about that for a minute. The first person they killed in this uprising is Nat Turner's owner, who Nat Turner says about him, I had no cause to complain of his treatment of me. So it begs the question, why would he kill him first? We'll come back to that. So they kill Nat Turner's owner, then they move from plantation to plantation, killing a total of 55 whites and picking up more and more rebel slaves along the way. By morning, there were about 60 people in this rebel group. Now, by morning, unfortunately, they didn't really have a great plan of escape. And as they keep growing more and more in number, it's harder and harder to hide. So by morning, whites are forming a local militia, they gather the weapons, and they go out to hunt down this rebel party. And more than 40 blacks will be arrested and executed for the revolt. Nat Turner, however, escaped. He will hide for 2 months in the woods, evading capture. Unfortunately, after 2 months, he's accidentally discovered by another slave who then informs local whites where he's at. And of course, he is going to be put to death. But before he dies, he dictates a very lengthy confession. And basically, it strikes fear into the hearts and minds of Southerners because if an intelligent, well-treated slave such as Nat Turner, who had no cause of concern or could complain of the treatment of his master, if he could plot a revolt, could white Southerners ever feel safe? And of course, the answer is no. And of course, why did Nat Turner do it? Because no matter how well his master treated him, the man was still his master. Nat Turner was still unfree and a slave. And it only reinforces that untold truth among Southerners that slaves don't want to be slaves. They're only there by sheer force and fear. And so all three of these, whether it's Gabriel Prosser's rebellion, Denmark Bessie's plot, or Nat Turner's revolt, these are the only examples. These are just the most prominent examples. Conspiracies and actual or rumored slave resistance began from the beginning of the first slave coming over and never ceased until the end of the Civil War. These plots exposed the truth that Southerners preferred to ignore. Only force kept African Americans enslaved. And because no system of control can ever be total, white Southerners could never be completely safe from the possibility of a revolt. Nat Turner brought those white Southern fears to the surface. And after 1831, the possibility, the threat of a slave insurrection was never far from their minds. So again, slavery is under attack from within. But it was also coming under attack from without. In the North, there were a number of Northern whites and former slaves, and also African Americans who began to push the abolition movement. Again, this would fall largely under the antebellum reform ideas. So they see the evil, they want to correct it. In this case, one of the most famous early white abolitionists is William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison plays an important role coming out of the Second Great Awakening. In 1831, he broke with those, there's many whites who were abolitionists. They believe what's called gradual abolition. In other words, let's take some time, let's free them over time, let's allow Southern whites to get compensated, allow the economy to adjust. But William Lloyd Garrison broke away from that more moderate mainstream idea of abolitionism, gradual abolitionism. And he invoked what he called immediatism. In other words, the immediate end to slavery. In 1831, he founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he began publishing his very own newspaper, The Liberator. By 1838, there were more than 250,000 members of the American Anti-Slavery Society, with 1,300 branch locations. And his newspaper? Well, it was riveting. In his very first edition of The Liberator, Garrison made his position very clear. Quote, "I will be harsh as truth, as uncompromising as justice. On this subject of ending slavery, I do not wish to think, or speak, or write with moderation. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." Unquote. Garrison was a man incapable of compromise. He would settle for nothing less than the immediate end to slavery. Garrison and his newspaper, The Liberator, will shape and transform this new anti-slavery movement. The thing is, Garrison's approach was designed to mount a sweeping crusade that would condemn slavery as sinful and demand its immediate abolishment. He even took the radical step that demanded full social equality for African Americans, referring to them individually as a, quote, "a man and a brother, a woman and a sister," unquote. Think about this for a minute. Not only is he saying this is a sinful, immoral thing, institution of slavery, there's no reason to compromise, no reason to wait, no reason to compensate slave owners. Slave owners are evil. They are doing an evil, vile, despicable, sinful thing. End it now. And unlike most whites, he actually believed in full social equality. They are brothers and sisters. They are human beings equal. Now, on the one hand, his determination electrifies the anti-slavery abolitionist movement. On the other hand, his inability to compromise limited his effectiveness as a leader. Think about it. If you were refusing to ever compromise at all, so if someone comes to him and says, hey, can you work with me and maybe we can end this gradually? Well, it's not what he wants. It is a step in the right direction, theoretically. Because he's incapable of compromise, he won't even give you the time of day. So it limits his broad appeal, but it does electrify the movement. And with him, with William Lloyd Garrison, along with people who flocked to hear firsthand accounts of slavery from Frederick Davis and Sojourner Truth, Northerners began to eagerly read these firsthand accounts, as well as pick up the Liberator, and began to understand just how bad slavery was in the South. Now, William Lloyd Garrison, despite maybe some questionable leadership techniques, he was a man committed. In fact, after 35 years, 1,820 issues of the Liberator, Garrison never failed to publish a single issue. Again, these messages, whether it was Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, William Lloyd Garrison, all these abolitionists began to employ this stylized revival evangelical preacher style of message that was popularized by preachers of the Second Great Awakening. They're confrontational, they're very personal in their message, they're denunciatory, and they speak to your emotions. And as they begin to make some headways, they begin to adopt another tactic of the Second Great Awakening revivalists. They begin not only to use the power of persuasion, i.e. moral suasion, they begin to publish these tracts, these pamphlets, in order to convince others that slavery was a sinful institution. Now, of course, this will be met with mixed response in both the North and South, but that is something we'll talk about in the second half of this lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.